deep under the ocean, on the most dangerous day in modern history, the world was seconds away from a nuclear exchange that would have triggered a global war and killed hundreds of millions of people. The decision to launch a nuclear torpedo rested on 3 Soviet officers in crushing darkness, thousands of feet beneath the waves, inside a steel tube that was rapidly running out of air. 2 of them said yes. This is the story of the one man who said no. His name was Vasily Arkhipov. This is Monochrome Documentaries. We bring history's overlooked heroes to center stage. Our story starts in the frigid gray expanse of the Arctic, at a Soviet naval base on the Kola Peninsula. On October 1st, 1962, 4 Soviet Foxtrot-class submarines slipped out of port and vanished into the North Atlantic. Their mission was simple, brutal, and secret: reach Cuba without being detected. The crew didn't know the full political chessboard, only that tensions were rising fast and that they were sailing straight into the storm. These weren't ordinary submarines. Besides their conventional torpedoes, each one carried a single, terrifying weapon. A special weapon, as it was called. This was a nuclear-tipped torpedo with an estimated yield of 10 to 15 kilotons, roughly the same destructive power as the bomb that flattened Hiroshima. Aboard one of these subs, the B-59, was a man who was no stranger to nuclear catastrophe: Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov. He was the flotilla's chief of staff, making him the commodore of the whole submarine brigade. Just 1 year earlier, Arkhipov had been an officer on the K-19 submarine when it suffered a catastrophic reactor coolant leak. With the reactor nearing meltdown and all communications cut, Arkhipov helped rig a makeshift repair that saved the sub but exposed the crew to horrific doses of radiation. 8 men died within weeks. More than a dozen others would follow in the next 2 years. Arkhipov himself was irradiated. He had stared into the face of nuclear disaster once before, and now he was sailing straight towards it again. The voyage itself was a special kind of hell. Foxtrot-class subs were designed for the icy Arctic, not the tropics. As they sailed south, the air conditioning gave out. Temperatures inside the cramped compartments soared past 113 degrees Fahrenheit. For days on end, the crew of B-59 was completely cut off from Moscow, too deep to even pick up civilian radio. They were blind, deaf, and totally alone. The air grew thick and heavy with carbon dioxide. Men were fainting from the heat. They were rationing water. Every surface was slick with sweat and condensation. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Imagine being sealed in a dark, sweltering metal coffin, hundreds of feet underwater, knowing the world above you might have already ended. The B-59 wasn't a submarine anymore. It was a pressure cooker, and the men inside were at their breaking point. The captain of the B-59 was Valentin Savitsky. He was a capable commander, but the strain of the mission was clearly getting to him. Alongside him and Arkhipov was the ship's political officer, Ivan Maslenikov. In the Soviet system, the political officer was a co-commander of sorts, there to ensure ideological loyalty. The fate of the world would soon come down to these 3 men. October 27, 1962. Historians now call this day Black Saturday. It was the single most dangerous day of the entire crisis. The day the world came closer than ever to nuclear war. Events were spiraling out of control. High over Cuba, a Soviet missile shot down an American U-2 spy plane, killing the pilot. To many in the Pentagon, this was an act of war. Then, in another terrifying mix-up, a different U-2 accidentally flew into Soviet airspace over Siberia. Soviet MiGs scrambled to intercept it, and American fighters, armed with nuclear-tipped missiles, took off to protect the spy plane. For a few horrifying minutes, a dogfight over the Arctic threatened to ignite the whole planet. While generals and presidents scrambled, another drama was playing out in the Sargasso Sea. An American naval task force built around the aircraft carrier USS Randolph and its 11 destroyers was hunting for Soviet subs. Their mission: enforce the quarantine line and force any subs they found to surface. And on Black Saturday, they found B-59. For the crew of the USS Randolph, it was just procedure. They detected a sub, and their orders were to make it identify itself. To do this, they began dropping small, non-lethal signaling depth charges, explosives about the size of a hand grenade, designed to send a loud shockwave through the water. It was meant to be a knock on the door, not an attack. The Americans were assuming the Soviets knew this was the signal. They were wrong. That message had never reached B-59. Inside the submarine, all the crew knew was the terrifying, violent reality of explosions. The steel hull shuddered with each blast. Lights flickered and died. To the exhausted, oxygen-starved men on B-59, this wasn't a signal, it was an attack. The war had started. For 4 agonizing hours, the American destroyers were relentless, circling above, dropping charge after charge, pinning the submarine down. Captain Savitsky was at the end of his rope. He was cut off from home. His submarine was being battered. His crew was suffering, and he believed he was under a full-scale assault. In the claustrophobic control room of B-59, lit by the dim red glow of emergency lights, panic was boiling over into rage. The air was unbreathable, the heat unbearable. Each new explosion sent a fresh wave of terror through the boat. Captain Savitsky, his face slick with sweat, saw only one option left. He was a cornered animal, and he was about to lash out with unimaginable force. According to the account of Vadim Orlov, a communications officer on board, Savitsky finally snapped. He was convinced World War III was raging on the surface and that his submarine was doomed. But he wasn't going down without a fight. He turned to his officers and, his voice strained with fury, reportedly shouted, "Maybe the war has already started up there. We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy." The order was given to prepare the special weapon. This wasn't a drill. The 10-kiloton warhead, a weapon that could vaporize an aircraft carrier and boil the sea around it, was being readied. The target, the flagship of the American fleet, the USS Randolph. The consequences would have been immediate and irreversible. President Kennedy had made America's position terrifyingly clear. Any nuclear launch from Cuba would be seen as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States itself, demanding a full retaliatory response. The American task force had no idea B-59 even had a nuclear weapon. If that torpedo had been fired, they would have seen it as the opening shot of World War III. The launch codes would have been opened. Bombers would have scrambled. Missiles would have flown. Cities would have turned to ash. The chain reaction of global annihilation would have begun, all because of a decision made in a sweltering control room, thousands of feet under the sea. The final decision to launch now rested on a crucial Soviet protocol. According to most accounts, the rule for using the special weapon was clear. It required the unanimous consent of the 3 senior officers on board: Captain Savitsky, Political Officer Maslenikov, and Flotilla Chief of Staff Vasily Arkhipov. In the suffocating tension of the control room, Captain Savitsky had made his choice. He was ready to launch. He turned to his political officer, Ivan Maslenikov. The political officer agreed. He gave his consent. 2 votes for yes. The world was now 1 vote away from Armageddon. All eyes turned to Vasily Arkhipov. This was the moment. The explosions kept rocking the submarine. The captain was demanding they launch. The political officer agreed. Every military instinct screamed to follow the chain of command. But Vasily Arkhipov had seen firsthand what uncontrolled nuclear power does to the human body on the K-19. He understood its finality in a way few others did. He knew the chaos and panic around him was the worst possible environment to make a decision of this magnitude. And so, he did the unthinkable. He said no. Arkhipov stood his ground. He became the voice of reason in a room filled with panic. He argued that if this was a real attack meant to destroy them, they'd already be dead. These explosions, he insisted, had to be signals. They had no confirmation from Moscow that war had even started. To launch a nuclear weapon based on assumption and fear wasn't just a breach of protocol. It was a death sentence for everyone on Earth. An intense argument broke out between the 3 men. Savitsky was furious that his authority was being challenged and kept demanding the launch. But Archipov's position gave him unique authority. He wasn't just another officer on B-59. He was the commodore of the entire flotilla, and his reputation preceded him. The men knew his story from the K-19. They knew he was a man who had faced down a nuclear disaster before and kept his head. Slowly, methodically, Arkhipov talked the captain down. His calm logic began to cut through Savitsky's rage. He persuaded the captain that the only sane course of action was to surface and await orders. The argument was fierce, but in the end, reason won. The order to launch the nuclear torpedo was canceled. The decision was made. B-59 would surface. The sub began its slow, groaning ascent toward the unknown. For the crew, these were terrifying moments. Were they surfacing to surrender, to be destroyed, or to find a world still at peace? Late that evening, B-59 broke the surface of the Atlantic and was immediately blinded. They were completely surrounded. American destroyers had closed in, pinning the sub in their powerful searchlights. The message was clear. You have nowhere to run. The exhausted Soviet submariners, gasping in the fresh night air, found themselves in the middle of a hornet's nest. But it was a hornet's nest that had no idea it had just been seconds away from being vaporized. The men on the American ships just saw a Soviet sub they had forced to the surface. They couldn't have imagined that the men emerging from that hatch had just been arguing about whether to launch a nuclear weapon at them. As former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara later admitted, we came very, very close to nuclear war. Closer than we knew at the time. But tense standoff followed. Through signals, the Americans ordered the sub to stand down and return to the Soviet Union. For B-59, the immediate crisis was over. After recharging its batteries, the submarine submerged and began the long, quiet journey home. The world above, completely oblivious, continued to hold its breath while Kennedy and Khrushchev negotiated a peaceful end to the crisis. On November 2nd, President Kennedy announced the Soviet missile bases were being dismantled. The world had stepped back from the brink, but almost no one knew that the person who pulled it back was a quiet naval officer on a submerged submarine. When Arkhipov returned home, there were no medals, no speeches, not even gratitude. The man who had stopped a nuclear war was reprimanded and told he should have gone down with the ship. His act of restraint, the decision that saved millions, was buried under secrecy and silence. What happened inside B-59 on Black Saturday was stashed away in the archives of the Soviet Navy for decades. Vasily Arkhipov quietly continued his naval career. He was promoted, eventually reaching the rank of Vice Admiral and holding senior positions in the Soviet Naval Academy system. He was a respected officer, but his single greatest contribution to humanity remained a state secret. He retired in the mid-1980s and lived a quiet life. In 1998, Vasily Arkhipov died of kidney cancer. Many, including his family, believe it was a consequence of the radiation he absorbed during the K-19 accident. He passed away in obscurity, his story still untold. It was only after the fall of the Soviet Union that the truth started to come out. At a 40th anniversary conference in 2002, former officers finally began to speak. Memoirs were published. Declassified documents filled in the blanks. For the first time, the world learned just how close it had come, and who it had to thank. In 2017, nearly 20 years after his death, Vasily Arkhipov was posthumously given the first ever Future of Life Award. His daughter and grandson accepted it on his behalf. The world was finally learning his name. The story of Vasily Arkhipov is a chilling reminder of how fragile our world really is. It shows that history doesn't just turn on the decisions of famous leaders, but on the courage of unknown individuals in unimaginable circumstances. In a sweltering, oxygen-starved control room, deep beneath the ocean, one man's refusal to give in to fear prevented a global catastrophe. He chose reason over rage, restraint over retaliation. His story is more than a historical footnote. It's a lesson, it's a warning, and it's proof that even in the darkest moments, one person, guided by their conscience, can save the world. If you found this story of a hidden hero as incredible as we did, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss more incredible stories from the shadows of history. Thanks for watching.